Yes, so when we're talking about population as it relates to how many representatives you get in the House, how many electoral college delegates that you get, everyone's included, men, women, and children, even though at least at that time white men were the only ones who could vote. And so the general thinking of the day was that like the man's the head of the household and the man will kind of vote on behalf of his entire family. So the idea was like, well, a woman doesn't need to vote because she's just going to vote for whatever her husband wants to vote for. We don't even need to worry about it. We'll just let her husband vote. Right? That was generally the interpretation. The reason why this three-fifths compromise and the issue of enslaved people counting towards the population is different is because it gave a disproportionate amount of power to states that enslaved people. So even though you could say, well, women and children were counting in the population but couldn't vote, that's true, but there weren't really big differences across the states, meaning there weren't some states that had a way higher proportion of women or a way higher proportion of children. It was pretty much the same ratio across all the different states. That's not true of enslaved people. There were some states that had zero enslaved people, and there were others, like South Carolina, that had more enslaved people than not enslaved people, right? And so the idea is that if you count enslaved people also as part of that population, you are really privileging states that enslave people. You're actually giving them a political incentive to enslave more people, create more enslaved people, because all it's doing is increasing their representation and their power in the federal government without diluting the vote at all. Now, I want to be really clear. We're talking about this in very technical terms, right? Like, because you have to understand that in the legal system and the institutions that were built by the founding fathers, enslaved people were classified basically legally as economic property, not human beings. We had a system called chattel slavery, which means that the status of slavery was permanent and was hereditary. It was passed down. And so the argument was this really counterintuitive argument where you had anti-slavery advocates essentially arguing that enslaved people should not count as a person in the population because they're like, you're not treating them as people in any other way. And so you shouldn't get to also count them towards your population and boost your own voice and your own power. Whereas enslavers were actively arguing that enslaved people should count as a whole person, but not for charitable reasons, not because they saw them as a whole person, because they wanted to be able to increase their numbers of delegates, representatives, that sort of thing. I hope that makes sense.